boy, there's a lot of Redfall content to talk about right now, isn't there? We have the recently announced Developer Direct, where a few of the Xbox and Bethesda studios will showcase their upcoming titles in a smaller, more bite-sized format than the traditional large-scale E3 briefings. One of the games being shown is Redfall, which will have a good portion of time allotted to reveal more in-depth details about both the multiplayer and single-player combat, customization, world bosses, and more. Not only that, a new article focused on Redfall was released by Gamesradar featuring interviews with Ricardo Bear and Harvey Smith, the creative leads on the project. That article will be the focus of today's video, as some interesting new pieces of information were shared that help to shed more light on exactly what kind of game Redfall will be, or more accurately, the kind of games that Redfall will be inspired by. When Redfall was initially revealed, it drew very heavy comparisons to other 4-player co-op shooters with a similar style, namely Left 4 Dead. Those comparisons were superficial at best. Yes, both games have 4-player co-op where you fight forms of the undead, but the similarities pretty much end there. Redfall also distinguishes itself from both Left 4 Dead and previous Arkane titles by featuring the studio's first truly open-world environment. Beginning the article, both Harvey Smith and Ricardo Bear enlighten us to the thought process behind pivoting the Austin studio from more compact mission-based games to a full open world. It's certainly true that if you work on the same thing for long enough, you eventually want to clear your head and stretch a little, says Arkane studio director Harvey Smith. Maybe we stretched too much this time. We probably should have picked either an open world or cooperative multiplayer. But if Redfall comes together at the quality level we think it will, then it will be a different beast. It's really tremendous. It does a lot of cool stuff. Redfall isn't the video game that you think it is. Following its reveal, the Xbox Series X exclusive has drawn comparisons to the Left 4 Deads of this world. Great games, concedes Arkane creative director Ricardo Bear, but not exactly what the studio is shooting for. It's totally understandable for somebody to come to that conclusion. There are 4 playable characters, you can play together cooperatively, and you're going against the undead. But in terms of the way that you play and experience Redfall, it's not like those games at all. Redfall is more like loading into Far Cry. Now, I know that many of you may hear this and want to pull out your torches and pitchforks at the mere mention of the Far Cry series, games that have earned a notable reputation in the open world genre for being both approachable and fun to play, while also suffering from bloat and unnecessary grind and tedium. Far Cry is a series with wide mainstream appeal, but the games have visibly declined in quality over the past several years, pretty much since the release of Far Cry 3, the game that many consider to be the peak of the franchise. Far Cry as a franchise was not always so middling in quality, however. In fact, I'd personally argue that the apex of the series was reached prior to the third entry, and that would be Far Cry 2. Funnily enough, the game director for Far Cry 2, Clint Hawking, has been an outspoken fan of the immersive sim genre for quite some time. Just another reason why I love Far Cry 2, as it takes some very clear inspiration from some of the earliest simulation-style games. The open-world template that Far Cry 3 established and Ubisoft has run into the ground are what people tend to take primary issue with, myself included. It's a formula that has become so dull and repetitive, but Arkane Studios have an exciting opportunity to show us how the Far Cry formula could be innovated and expanded upon in ways that align with their creative values as the pioneers of modern immersive sims, while also reinvigorating the interest in that established Far Cry formula in a new context. What excites me about this, surprisingly, is that Far Cry 2 was specifically mentioned as a point of inspiration foundation for Redfall, alongside the Stalker series, another noteworthy open-world FPS franchise. Redfall sometimes feels like what you'd get if you blended the Arkane creative values with Far Cry 2 or Stalker, Smith continues. That's the kind of thing that we have wanted to do for a long time. You may find instances of combat, story vignettes, or countless chaotic results as Arkane's systems clash together. One part of this complex puzzle is the day-night cycle, which remains despite a powerful vampire god, the Black Sun, having established a local eclipse. The sun sets and the sun rises, and we have different times of the day, says Smith. It changes the feel of the game radically. Smith doesn't mean from a purely visual aesthetic either, with the time impacting everything from how viable stealth is before combat erupts to how the various factions appear in the world. Vampires may spawn during the day but remain dormant, becoming active at nightfall. Bellwether security may up their patrols before the cultists come out in force to greet the Shadow Walkers. Sometimes all three of these factions will be caught at war, with your squad acting as casual bystanders to the carnage of competing interests. Smith says, you may start a mission at high noon and get distracted along the way. By the time you reach the objective, it may be nighttime with different enemy spawns. Every slight difference pushes you naturally to take a different approach. Interesting tidbit in there, by the way, about our potential main villain of the game being given a name for the very first time: the Black Sun, the vampiric creature that creates the eclipse over the island. Going back to the previous point of discussion, Harvey Smith and Ricardo Bear both talk about some more of the things that differentiate Redfall from both the open world template of Far Cry and the litany of horde-inspired shooters that spun out of Left 4 Dead's popularity. When you think of Far Cry, your mind is likely flooded with images of exotic landscapes and faraway paradises. Redfall is embracing more familiar territory, what Smith lovingly describes as a quote-unquote crappy tourist town in New England. Creepy cornfields and abandoned fairgrounds, dilapidated houses and cold seaside boardwalks, and plenty of bars and restaurants held in ill repute by the locals. Well, they were, until most were driven away by the invading vampires, the cultists who worship them, and Bellwether Security, a shady private military company looking for nothing but trouble. When we started on Redfall, we wanted to tackle a familiar location for once, laughs Smith, speaking to Arkane's propensity for building elaborate destinations. Dunwall, an industrial whaling city overrun with plague rats, Talos 1, an alt-history space station with an alien ecology, and Black Reef, an island cursed to time loop through the swinging 60s. We wanted to take a familiar setting and go deep on it. Redfall Island should be a place where, after hours of exploration, you feel like you know it the way you know Talos or Dunwall. When I say we wanted to stretch, that's what I mean. What if we took all of our experience and our creative values and put it into an open world? That world is where Redfall really diverges from any lingering horde shooter comparisons. Those genre games have a familiar rhythm. Load into linear missions with friends and fight waves of enemies until the end. Redfall has a broader objective, affording you the freedom to linger or fight at your leisure. Defining the shape of your adventure is all part of the appeal. You're in a big-ass open world, enthuses Bear. We have a home base where you can talk to NPCs and get side quests. You can go to the mission table and pick up story-driven missions, or you can not give a shit about any of that and just head outside. Pick a direction, start hauling ass, and run into the living world stuff that we have going on. Some new info shared here is that there will be a hub or a home base to return to from your excursions into the open world. You can find human NPCs there, probably some of the townsfolk who managed to escape the vampires, cultists, and security forces, and they'll be able to provide you with side quests. Sounds like pretty standard open world stuff, but you gotta remember that this is Arkane Studios putting their unique spin on this, so it should be pretty cool. cool. If you're afraid that Arkane is straying too far from their roots, Harvey Smith assuages any fears that players might have by stating that they will most likely return to the linear and contained style of their previous games. He also explains, though, that they wanted to try the open world approach for at least one game and see how that presents more possibilities for players to immerse themselves in the setting. I think we will eventually go back to the very sealed, immersive sim-like environments, Smith considers, but just once we wanted to know what it would be like to wander in Arkane open world and see where each little road will take you. You'll want to see if you can get into a barn you found, climb a fire lookout tower that you spotted in the distance, or try and get into a house to read all the notes scattered inside, Smith continues, explaining that you'll still have the freedom to approach missions, areas, and in-world locations with the same curiosity and ingenuity as you could in Dishonored or Prey. Some of Redfall's most powerful moments come from wandering around, absorbing the world, and getting caught up in high action for a moment. That was the atmosphere we set out to create from the beginning. Ricardo Bear expands on the distinction between Redfall's open world and its contemporaries, and some of the themes and vibes they wanted the player to experience, while also revealing that Redfall will not feature drivable vehicles of any kind, as Redfall has been designed to be a strictly on-foot journey. If there's a negative to be drawn from a Far Cry comparison, it's one of scale. Ubisoft's open worlds have become debilitatingly large, and I'll cop to feeling some sense of hesitation before launching into a new one these days. But there's a key distinction in Redfall's design which calmed my nerves. There are no vehicles. In terms of freedom, that's what you would expect from other open worlds, but Redfall is an on-foot game. The scale and the pace is a little slowed down in that respect, says Bear. We want you creeping through a cornfield at night in the fog, hearing vampires whisper in the dark. Maybe you'll spot a farmhouse in the distance and sneak over to it, only to find that it's full of cultists and a few trapped survivors who you can save. That's the kind of vibe that Redfall has. I actually find vehicles in open worlds to be kind of a hindrance to the experience personally, and some of my favorite open world games of all time feature no vehicles whatsoever, so this is refreshing to hear, at least for me. The article continues, and Harvey Smith goes into more detail about the co-op experience in Redfall. Freedom has always been a core aspect of Arkane games. Smith admits that the introduction of multiplayer costs you some things, due to the game needing to register an event, communicate it to the server, deliver it out to the other players. But that isn't to say that Redfall will be any less of an Arkane game because of this creative decision. If anything, fans of Dishonored and Prey should relish the opportunity to see how aspects like advancing RPG powers, immersive movement and shooting, fluid sliding and climbing can combine into a more ambitious design scenario. What you get in exchange is tremendous, says Smith. When 4 people sit down to play through Redfall together and they are synergizing their powers, aiding each other, and kicking off emergent events, it brings tremendous value. Cooperation is optional. You can slay alone or squad up, with Redfall seamlessly blending single-player and multiplayer options. Not all that dissimilar to the Borderlands games. And the comparisons to Gearbox's co-op shooter don't end there. At the beginning of Redfall, you'll be able to choose between one of 4 characters: Devinder Crowsley, the verified cryptid hunter; Layla Ellison, the telekinetic threat in Student Debt; Jacob Boyer, the Deadeye with an undead eye; and Remy De La Rosa, the ingenious engineer. Once you start the campaign, your character selection is locked in for the duration of the game. If you choose to play solo, you'll do so without the other 3 heroes around you. In co-op, there is no restriction on multiples of the same vampire hunter joining one party, although Smith says that there are benefits to having a well-rounded group outside of the variety it will bring to combat. We have a very dynamic dialogue system where, depending on what heroes you put together in combination, they will talk to each other and get to know one another. And we have a mechanical system where the longer the heroes play together, the more intimate their dialogue lines become, and eventually they'll get a game mechanic buff called the Trust buff. The info about the Trust buff is brand new and also really cool. I love the idea that the longer you play the game in co-op, your team of players receives a buff of some kind, whether that be more health, weapon damage, or damage resistance. Ricardo Bear goes on to talk about the gunplay of Redfall and how Arkane turned to their sister studio in Texas, id Software, for advice on how to make the weapon feedback feel satisfying. Regardless of how you choose to play this drop-in, drop-out experience, Arkane is keen to emphasize that flexibility is at the heart of Redfall. The game will support stealth combat and all guns blazing approaches, and everything in between as you cycle through a massive arsenal of weapons, and as the unique powers inherent to each of the heroes begin to combine. While it is true that this is more of a shooter than anything else we've ever worked on, Bear considers, a lot of the fun comes from each of the heroes' powers, whether you are synergizing Remy and Jacob together, or even if just playing by yourself. Using the powers, combining them, and upgrading your character is a lot of fun. Even with a renewed focus on advancing supernatural powers, Arkane knew it had to get the gunplay right. There's a certain level of work you have to put into a shooter to just reach the minimum bar, because you'll inevitably get compared to all the other shooters out there if your guns don't feel good, says Bear, who notes that the studio hired in FPS experts at the outset of production and even looked to the broader Bethesda network for assistance. We got insight from some of our sister studios. The people who worked on Doom came over and gave us feedback a couple of times, things like that, and we're pretty happy with the results. We have the usual array of weapons like assault rifles and like that, many of which are jury-rigged by the locals because they've been cut off, Smith adds, who notes that standard guns are equipped with random modifiers when you find them. But the real draw to Redfall's FPS combat is the special vampire hunting weapons. Your weapons can have stakes on the end. If the vampires are vulnerable, the only way to truly kill them is to stake them, otherwise they regenerate. There are flare guns, UV beams, and even stake launchers, which use found ammo like broken off pool cues and fireplace pokers. Bear adds, you know, the kind of weapons you would want if you were having to kill vampires. You won't hold on to weapons for long though. Smith and Bear are keen to emphasize that part of the RPG economy of Redfall involves looking at the traits of each weapon you find and deciding if it's what you really want. Smith uses the example of two shotguns he stumbled across in the wild. One, a double-barreled Menace that has a greater chance to set hazards on fire, and the other that offers more long-range viability and a percentage chance to fire off a UV flash to petrify vampires within a 10-foot radius. It's all about defining your playstyle, scrapping guns when you outlevel them, and picking weapons which complement your chosen path through the skill trees. Each hero has 4 available, grouping specific character traits and more general utility options like health recovery or increased storage for ammunition and lockpicks. It's all a part of a dynamic combat system that we have going on. Knowing when to use one gun versus another, and knowing when to switch to one of the vampire hunter guns is all relevant to the experience, says Smith. This sounds a lot like Borderlands, to be honest, where you're constantly picking up new weapons and gear to use, swapping out the old for the new on a consistent basis. Borderlands is a series that is close to my heart, and I have a lot of fond memories of playing that series back in the day. So any gameplay mechanics that can be compared to those games is a good thing, at least in my eyes. The final paragraphs of the article talk about the benefits of Xbox Game Pass and how a wider demographic of gamers will have access to Arkane's games than ever before. Harvey Smith also talks about how frightening it will be to see how many players jump into Redfall within the first week of release and how much feedback they'll be receiving. Redfall is a different type of game for Arkane. That much is clear from the open world, the cooperative design, and the enhanced focus on gunplay. But underpinning every design decision are the studio's creative values and its instinctual lean towards creating immersive, simulated spaces. But there's added pressure this time around, owing in part to a certain subscription service. I feel like with Xbox Game Pass, the potential is here for us to say, this is Arkane, and these are our creative values. We can expose a lot of people to the way that we make games. I hope we can turn people on to what we do. Deep world creation, environmental storytelling, the emergent results of combat and your powers, and creating lovingly crafted worlds with a real sense of history and character. The pool that Game Pass offers is huge for us. It's kind of shocking and scary in a way, like how many people are going to play Redfall in the first week? What if it's a lot more than we anticipated? We're going to get a lot of feedback very quickly, and a lot of people will see what we've spent the last few years on. Redfall is our pandemic game, man. It's easy to forget now, but there were dark days during the pandemic. People on my team were sitting at home alone, losing their minds because we didn't have vaccines yet, and nobody was sure what it meant for their kids and for the economy. The team carried each other through it all. ZeniMax, Bethesda, and Microsoft were very good to us during that difficult time. Now that we're on the other side of it, the last thing I got to do here is ship Redfall. Some other smaller details are covered here and there in the article, like the personal inspirations behind implementing co-op in Redfall, and some of the environmental hazards you can use to fight the vampiric menace, but I'll be leaving a link to the article in the description below for those of you who may be interested in reading it for yourself. In the meantime, these are some of the details that I felt were worth mentioning, but now I want to know what you think in the comments down below. Do the comparisons to Far Cry make you more excited or less excited for Redfall? Will you purchase the game outright at launch, or will you give it a try on Game Pass? Sound off and let's discuss. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like on the video and share it around with other members of the Bethesda and Arkane Outsiders community. It really helps to get the channel noticed. Consider subscribing to the channel for more Redfall content like this, and be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember that the outsider walks among us. Thanks for watching, everyone.